Very much for this kind of introduction. Hello everyone, can you hear me? Okay? Is it okay? Okay. I'm very happy to be here. I would like to thank Gilad and Gilad for inviting me and Cedric for organizing the whole, for being the host of this conference. In the last decade of his life, Derrida developed an interest in the concept of hospitality. Prior to Kant, very few philosophers had dealt with it, although it plays a prominent role in Greek poetry and in the Bible. When Derrida turns to this topic, therefore, it is mostly Kantian territory. However, Derrida's deconstruction of hospitality as aporetic and his understanding of Levinas' ethics as Messianic hospitality have engendered a new scholarship that has turned hospitality into a major concept in ethical and political philosophy, political theory, in international law, and in international relations. Today I would like to examine Levinas and Derrida's conception of hospitality and ask if it is possible to extract from their philosophies epistemic, political, or moral principles that could guide our understanding of real-life crisis and our search for solutions. In the first section of the paper, I outline the main points in Derrida's deconstruction of hospitality and his understanding of Levinas' position on this topic. In the second section, I turn to one of Levinas' texts on hospitality discussed by Derrida, and I offer a critical perspective on it. In the concluding section, I discuss the Messianism of Derrida's and Levinas' understandings of hospitality and the extent or limits of its possible relevance in the empirical world. So Derrida's deconstruction of hospitality elaborates on 2 points. The first is the hostile tension existing in all situations of hospitality. The second is the contradiction between hospitality as an unconditional ethical law and hospitality as a set of conditional political laws. In the first session of his 1995-1996 seminar on hospitality, Derrida challenges Kant's notion of the opposition between hospitality and hostility. In Perpetual Peace, Kant defines hospitality as, quote, the right of a stranger not to be treated with hostility when he arrives on someone else's territory. Glossing on Emile Benveniste's analysis of the Latin roots of hospitality, Derrida emphasizes the 3 meanings unfolding from these roots: host, enemy, and master, or householder, or sovereign. Etymologically, hospitality comprises a tension between the act of welcoming the stranger and the fear of or the threat presented by the enemy. This tension is tempered by the theme of sovereignty, the power of the householder. In his seminar, Derrida dwells on the extreme examples of the biblical stories of Sodom, Genesis 19, and the concubine at Gibeah, in Judges 19, in which members of the host society seek to rape guests given shelter by one of their fellow citizens. In monolinguism, he applies this analysis to colonialism, namely to the power relations between settlers and indigenous populations. The risk of conquest, he says, is present each time people settle in a territory which is not theirs and import new ways of life into their new country of residence. Hostility, or the risk of aggression against either the foreign guests or the hosting natives, is subjacent in all situations of hospitality. Derrida sums up the relationship between hospitality and hostility as a confrontation between 2 languages: the foreign's mother tongue and the host tongue, i.e. the political or patriarchal logos, the language of the state. On the one hand, inherent with hospitality is the danger of a violation of the foreigner's mother tongue, a form of violence perpetrated by the dominant logos. On the other hand, hospitality constitutes a danger for the dominant or patriarchal logos, in other words, for the state's order. The foreigner's language, i.e. her culture, her customs, her needs, her power, opens a breach in the dominant or patriarchal framework. to open one's door to a foreigner is equivalent to putting oneself into question or allowing oneself to be put into question, to be conquered. Strangers are a threat even when they behave in a peaceful manner because they bring with them an heterogeneous order that challenges existing rules. That threat is inherent to hospitality just as much as the threat implicit in the host's violent imposition on the dominant order on the guests. It is because of the risks of hostility that societies create laws which limit and condition the entrance of foreigners and how they can behave in the host territory. Hospitality consists, therefore, in concrete sets of rules which, while affirming the host's welcoming duty, confirm his power and his property. The laws of hospitality reinforce the definition of what belongs to the host, his house, his land, his country. While guests are invited to feel at home, they are required to do so in the host's home and in his language. However, says Derrida, there's another meaning of hospitality, one in which hospitality is unlimited and surrenders all property and all power, and absolute hospitality constituting endless welcoming of the other as other. According to this second level of hospitality, or perhaps this pure hospitality, the host unconditionally opens his house to the stranger and becomes the guest of his guest, or to use Levinas's vocabulary, his hostage. This pure hospitality, indeed, is that which Derrida explicitly extracts from Levinas's ethics. Thus, the second point that Derrida raises about hospitality is the contradiction between two levels, or two meanings of hospitality. Hospitality as the set of conditional laws, and hospitality as an unconditional law. These two levels of hospitality always and forever coexist, meaning that hospitality is aporetic. As such, hospitality has two dimensions, the political and the ethical, which negates each other. Hospitality is good, necessary, it's a right, a duty, an obligation, a law, the greeting of a foreign other as a friend, but on the condition that the host, the one who receives, lodges, or gives asylums, remains the boss, the master of the household, on the condition that he maintains his own authority on his own home, and thereby affirms the law of identity which delimits the very place of proffered hospitality and maintains authority over it, maintains the truth of authority, remains the place of his maintaining, which is to say, of truth, thus limiting the gift proffered and making of this limitation, the gift proffered, and making of this limitation, namely the being oneself in one's own home, the condition of the gift and of hospitality. This is the principle of both the Constitution and the implosion of the concept of hospitality. Hospitality is a self-contradictory concept and experience which can only self-destruct or protect itself from itself, auto-immunize itself in some way, which is to say, deconstruct itself precisely in being put into practice. In the text, A Word of Welcome, that this conclusion leads to an analysis of the relationship between ethics and politics in Levinas. There, however, Derrida faces a difficulty. On the one hand, he argues that Levinas's ethics is synonymous with the unconditional law of hospitality. On the other hand, however, Derrida wonders whether, quote, the ethics of hospitality that we try to analyze in Levinas's thought would be able to found laws and politics, end of quote. But why look for the conditional in the unconditional? How could Levinas's unconditional hospitality serve as the foundation for a conditional hospitality? While the concept of hospitality auto-immunizes itself because it has both ethical and political implications, Levinas's ethics calls for not hospitality in general, but unconditional hospitality. Where will Derrida find the political dimension of hospitality in Levinas's ethics? In fact, Derrida acknowledges that there is no clear passage between Levinas's philosophy of hospitality and a politics of hospitality. But then he makes a gesture that I much later, formulated as the main argument of my own book, Levinas's Politics. He turns to Levinas's Talmudic readings to find the political elements of Levinas's philosophy. Derrida looks for Levinas's political laws in his Jewish writings. I will not return here to Levinas' ethics of hospitality in general. What interests me in this paper is the relationship between ethics and politics that is expressed in some of Levinas' Talmudic readings. Here I focus on the reading The Nations and the Presence of Israel, which is commented on by Derrida and which is the basis of his understanding of Levinas' hospitality as messianic. The Nations and the Presence of Israel is a commentary on the fragment of Tractate Pesachim 118b, which according to Levinas deals with the relation of non-Jewish nations to messianic times. In Levinas' terms, the Talmudic discussion scrutinizes the relation, quote, of humanity to the election of Israel and the meaning of that election and the significance of Israel in the spirituality of the human. Levinas explains that the spiritual significance of Israel consists in fraternity and hospitality, which echo the word of God, and that, quote, one belongs to the messianic order when one has been able to admit others among one's own, end of quote. The message brought by Judaism to the world consists in the command to welcome the other, even when this other's alterity is a threat to or even a negation of the host. According to Levinas, in the Talmudic discussion, the non-Jewish world is divided into three categories: Egypt, Cush or Ethiopia, and Rome, each being paradigmatic of historical and socio-political characteristics. As he explains, Egypt, Cush, and Rome define the historical world in general, while Israel embodies the ahistorical word of God. In Levinas' understanding, the first form of national life, Egypt, represents political hospitality and reveals the dangers inherent to this hospitality, later analyzed by Derrida. Egypt is both a shelter and a place of enslavement. It first welcomed the people that it later enslaved. Egypt does not embody the unconditional law of hospitality, namely the word of God expressed by Israel, but it does embody real historical hospitality, which entails violence and threats. In Levinas' commentary, the Messiah cannot forgive at all the ambiguities of historical hospitality, but God, who knows what real life is made of, interferes in favor of Egypt because Egypt's hospitality, despite being political, expresses a memory of the word of God. A very different form of national life is represented by Rome. In the Talmudic extract, Rome is called criminal because it has conquered and destroyed Israel. In the rabbinic tradition, Rome is identified with Edom, which in turn is treated in the Bible as descended from Esau, the brother of Jacob, Israel. For that reason, in the Talmudic text, Rome claims brotherhood with Israel, a brotherhood that is also an antagonism. The meaning of the Talmudic text is extremely obscure, in particular because Rome or Edom, contrary to Egypt or Cush, is not explicitly mentioned in the psalm used by the rabbi in their discussion, which is Psalm 68, and their criticism of Rome is built on free association. Levinas, however, totally understands that the Talmudic text expresses a rabbinic obsession with the Greco-Roman order responsible for Israel exile, and against this obsession, he positions his own obsessions with the, quote, Western world in his 20th century American realization, and with anti-Semitic totalitarian regimes, the temptation of the Occident. Rome is the West, which, however fraternal, must be rejected as imperialistic, abusive, and violent. It is because of Levinas' emphasis on European, quote, bloody history, which its cult of heroism and military nobility, its nationalist exclusionism, its racial, social, and economic injustice, that his treatment of the third form of national life, Cush, will surprise and make us feel a bit uncomfortable. A country of black men with nothing to reproach itself for, nor anything to congratulate itself for. According to the Bible, at least, it's never the theater of important events, a purely geographical reference in holy history as well as in universal history without an active role, a bit marginal, neither friendly nor hostile to the message of Israel. A third or a fourth of mankind Is not its very silence and neutrality a natural goodwill of the noble savage? But then also perhaps praise for the eternal of Israel? Given the success of Egypt, which had enslaved Israel, Cush, whose hands remain clean, is welcome under the auspices of an a fortiori argument in which the peoples who do not have a complicated history are assigned with ease within the corruption of the civilizations, a philosophy of history. While Levinas's racist and chauvinist formulations have been widely discussed, one could think here that in this case he echoes the rabbi's prejudices. It is indeed clear that Levinas's assertion that Cush does not play any active role in relation to Israel comes from the fact that in the Talmud, which alludes to Egyptian hospitality and to Roman crimes, the Talmud adds no specific qualification to Cush. Levinas, however, gives free rein to his interpretive imagination when he emphasizes the color of Cush's inhabitants and claims that they have no complicated history. He qualifies them as black men, while neither the Bible nor the Talmud, at least here, focuses on skin color. He claims that they are passive bystanders, both in holy history and in universal history, and he asserts that they are indifferent to Israel's message. His words are reminiscent more of Hegel's views on Africa than on the rabbis, at least in this passage. Of course, Hegel's conception of Africa is not identical to that of Levinas. For Hegel, history is the actualization of spirit. The four stages of this actualization do not include Africa, which is not part of the development of spirit and hence of history. By contrast, Levinas, influenced by Rosenzweig, describes a human existence split into two categories. On the one hand, historical experiences, and on the other, transcendent and eternal values. Israel embodies the latter, while the rest of the world is immersed in history, namely in political events. Therefore, if for Hegel, Africa is part neither of history nor of spirit, which are the same thing, for Levinas it is part of history, but without playing any role in it, and it is indifferent to the Jewish spirit or word of God. Yes, yet, these differences notwithstanding, Hegel and Levinas share the belief that Africa's involvement in history is law, and that its spiritual consciousness is non-existent. I would like here to emphasize 3 points. The first is that for Levinas, the message brought to the world by Israel is a universal value. Of the people who express this message, however, Levinas says nothing. That is, the election of Israel, or even Israel tout court, consists in the enunciation of the word of God for all of humankind. God, Israel, and humanity are elements of the same story, the unconditional welcoming of the other. The desire of non-Jewish nations to participate in Messianic times means that they recognize the universal message formulated by Judaism. While the Jewish message is the expression of the universal word of God, only the non-Jewish peoples are treated as nations distinguished by a national solidarity. Therefore, the nations are nationally determined, while Israel is not. My second point is that for Levinas, welcoming the other is scary, dangerous, and even horrifying. On the one hand, hospitality can become enslavement, and hence, guests are always in danger. On the other hand, hospitality means welcoming the other despite the horror of a man for another who denies him in his alterity. The host loses himself in welcoming the other, but still he welcomes him. The threat, or even the horror, exists also at the national level. That a people should accept those who come and settle among them, even though they are foreigners, with their different practices and outfits, with their way of speaking and their smell. That the people should give them an arsania, lodgings, such as a place in the inn, and wherewithal to breathe and to live, is a song to the glory of the God of Israel. Simple tolerance, God alone knows how much love that tolerance demands. Love is demanded because the task is difficult difficult. No one does it easily. Levinas makes clear that hospitality should not be seen as a reflection of sentimental empathy, but as the realization of a transcendent command that puts into question the host's comfort, welfare, and security. The third point I'd like to argue here is that Levinas's categorization of the historical world illustrates the political and, in effect, non-ethical aspect of his Talmudic commentaries. For Levinas, indeed, ethic is the opening of the not yet defined ego to pure, undetermined otherness. Politics, on the other hand, means comparison and competition between defined identities. The thematization of politics is opposed to the color blindness of ethics. When Levinas asserts that Cush's inhabitants are black men, he's very far from his ethical claim that, quote, the best way of encountering the other is not even to notice the color of his eyes. His prejudice, then, exposes or is exposed by the two levels of analysis that coexist and contradict each other in his work, the ethical and the political. These 3 points lead us to the conclusion that the risk of racism and xenophobia exists in all instances of political hospitality, as it exists in all political practices and in all political considerations. Racism and xenophobia are political because politics is about categories, calculation, comparison, which involve choices, preferences, rejections, and eliminations. Ethics, by contrast, is so devoid of all specificity, both of the ego and of the other, that it escapes the risk of racism. A politic with no risk of racism, therefore, will be a politics entirely reworked by ethics. However, says Derrida, the price that ethics must pay for escaping the risk of racism is its abstraction and immateriality. The hosts and the guests' absolute nakedness, their absence of determinations of predicate, of empirical visibility, makes them similar to ghosts. Reworked by spectral ethics, therefore, politics becomes eschatological. Such a messianic hospitality is not hospitality as it is understood in law and politics. It is more than the offer of a refuge, but it is also less than that, because it cannot take place in the real world. It is postponed to messianic times. For Derrida, the spectrality or spirituality of Levinas's ethics has a deconstructive role because it puts into question the empirical visibility and the risk of racism that comes with it, and it endlessly defers the realization of hospitality. This deconstructive messianism, however, does not help us imagine a better empirical politics. To put it in the terms of a classical philosophical discourse, silence is kept concerning the rules or schemes that would provide us with the best or less bad mediations between ethics or the holiness of messianic hospitality on the one hand and the peace process, the process of political peace on the other. Ironically, Derrida's reticence about Levinas's hospitality can be reformulated as a criticism of Derrida's own messianic politics, namely of his concept of the democracy to come. In his book, Rogues, Derrida indicates that democracy is a reenactment of the aporia of hospitality at the level of conditional hospitality, that is, at the political level. In other words, not only does hospitality auto-immunize itself in the contradiction between its unconditional and conditional versions, but it also auto-immunizes itself at the level of its conditional laws. The second auto-immunization is called democracy. In its constitutive auto-immunity, in its vocation for hospitality, democracy has always wanted by turn and at the same time two incompatible things. It has wanted on the one hand to welcome only men, and on the condition that they be citizens, brothers, and compeers, excluding all the others, in particular bad citizens, rogues, non-citizens, and all sorts of unlike and unrecognizable others. And on the other hand, at the same time or by turns, it has wanted to open itself up, to offer hospitality to all those excluded. In both cases, let us recall, hospitality remains limited and conditional. This contradiction, however, is transcended by the democracy to come, a democracy detached detached from the concepts of country, nation, state, or citizen. By democracy to come, Derrida means another way to talk about democracy, not a form of regime that will be implemented in the future. Counterintuitively, democracy to come means the inheritance of something, quote, forgotten, repressed, misunderstood, or unthought in the old concept and throughout its history. This thing is hospitality and its aporetic character. Derrida's democracy to come deconstructs democracy just as Levinas's unconditional hospitality deconstructs hospitality, and in Messianic times welcomes everyone without racism or xenophobia. But neither Derrida's democracy to come nor Levinas's hospitality can be materialized in the empirical world, and neither do they let us imagine a better empirical world. As Derrida writes, no politics, no ethics, and no law can be, as it were, deduced from this thought. To be sure, nothing can be done with it, and so one would have nothing to do with it. But should we then conclude that this thought leaves no trace on what it is to be done, for instance, in the ethics, in the politics, the ethics, or the law to come? So can we use them in empirical times? Can they help us find an answer to the crisis of our age? My conclusion, sadly, will be ambiguous. On the one hand, Levinas's and Derrida's understanding of hospitality cannot be materialized either now or in the future. If their messianism means an endless deconstruction or contradiction that does not even let us imagine better times, they can hardly guide us in empirical situations. Thus, it seems that they are not of great use in helping us find solutions to the world's current ills. On the other hand, the impossibility of empirical materialization does not necessarily mean these ideas have no role to play. Hospitality as an idea, whether as a contradictory injunction or as a deconstructive process, functions, says Derrida, as the matrix of empirical determinations. It's not politics per se, but it creates the conditions for critique, for destabilization, for thinking that opens a public, a political space. I'm not sure it's enough. I'm not sure that making room for critique is not merely a way to solve philosophy's conscience. On the other hand, making room for critique is maybe the best that philosophy can do. Thank you.
Thank you.